When Jake Mitchell inherited his father's sprawling Texas ranch, he thought he knew everything about the man who raised him. But hidden within the dusty walls of the old homestead lay a secret so devastating it would shatter everything Jake believed about his family, his legacy, and the very ground beneath his boots. Sometimes the truth cuts deeper than any betrayal. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Broken Arrow Ranch as Jake Mitchell stood on the porch of his childhood home, watching the cattle graze in the distance. 3 months had passed since his father Samuel's funeral, and the weight of running the 10,000-acre spread still felt heavy on his shoulders. At 28, Jake had always assumed he'd have more time to learn from the old man before taking over the family business that had been in the Mitchell family for 4 generations. Samuel Mitchell had been a legend in Brazos County, a tough, fair rancher who built the Broken Arrow from nothing into one of the most successful cattle operations in Texas. Everyone respected him, from the bank president in town to the migrant workers who returned season after season to work his land. Jake had worshipped his father, following him around since he could barely walk, learning every aspect of ranching from branding to business. Now, as Jake walked through the main house preparing to clean out his father's study, he felt the familiar pang of grief mixed with overwhelming responsibility. His younger sister Emma had moved to Dallas years ago, showing no interest in ranch life, leaving Jake as the sole inheritor of their father's empire. The lawyer had assured him the transition would be smooth. The will was straightforward, leaving everything to Jake with a small trust fund for Emma. But as Jake opened the heavy oak desk that had been his father's command center for 30 years, something felt wrong. Hidden beneath a false bottom in the main drawer, his fingers found an envelope marked "Private," for Jake's eyes only, and his father's distinctive handwriting. The paper felt old, brittle, as if it had been waiting there for years. Jake's heart pounded as he carefully opened the envelope and pulled out what appeared to be a second will, dated just 6 months before his father's death. The official seal and notary stamps looked authentic, but the contents made Jake's blood run cold. This wasn't just another version of the will he'd already seen. It contained provisions that changed everything, mentioning people and agreements Jake had never heard of, including a name that would haunt him: Marcus Thornfield, listed as a 50% owner of the Broken Arrow Ranch. Jake read the document 3 times before the words truly sank in. According to this hidden will, his father had entered into a partnership agreement with Marcus Thornfield 25 years ago, giving Thornfield half ownership of the ranch in exchange for a massive loan that had apparently saved the Mitchell family from bankruptcy. The agreement stipulated that upon Samuel's death, Thornfield could claim his 50% stake or sell it back to the family for the current market value of the property, roughly $15 million. The revelation hit Jake like a physical blow. How could his father have hidden such a massive debt? How could he have risked the family legacy without telling anyone? Jake's hand shook as he searched through the rest of the desk, finding a series of letters between his father and Thornfield dating back over 2 decades. The correspondence painted a picture of a desperate man who made a deal with the devil to save his ranch during the cattle crisis of the late 1990s. Marcus Thornfield wasn't just any businessman. Jake recognized the name from newspaper articles about corporate land acquisitions across Texas. Thornfield Industries had been buying up failing ranches for years, converting them into strip malls, housing developments, and industrial complexes. The thought of the Broken Arrow suffering the same fate made Jake physically ill. Determined to understand the full scope of the situation, Jake drove into town to visit Harold Webb, the family's longtime attorney. Webb's reaction to seeing the second will was telling. His face went pale, and his hands trembled slightly as he examined the documents. After a long silence, Webb admitted he'd known about the partnership agreement, but had been sworn to secrecy by Samuel. He explained that Samuel had been making payments to Thornfield for years, believing he was buying back his stake in the ranch little by little. But according to Webb's records, Samuel had only managed to pay off about 30% of the debt before his death. Thornfield still held a legitimate claim to a significant portion of the Broken Arrow, and given the current real estate boom in Texas, he'd be foolish not to exercise his rights. Webb's advice was simple but devastating. Jake needed to prepare for either paying Thornfield an enormous sum or losing half of everything his family had built. The latter also revealed that Thornfield had already been in contact, expressing his condolences and his intention to discuss the future of their mutual investment very soon. 2 days later, Marcus Thornfield arrived at the Broken Arrow Ranch in a convoy of black SUVs that seemed to swallow the morning light. Jake watched from the porch as a tall, silver-haired man in an expensive suit stepped out of the lead vehicle, flanked by lawyers and assistants carrying briefcases and surveying equipment. Thornfield's smile was practiced and cold as he approached, extending a manicured hand that had never held a rope or felt the weight of honest labor. "Jake Mitchell, I presume," Thornfield said, his voice smooth as silk but sharp as a blade. "I was sorry to hear about your father. Samuel was a unique man with a strong sense of pride, perhaps too strong for his own good." The meeting took place in Samuel's study, the same room where Jake had discovered the hidden will. Thornfield spread out maps and documents across the desk with the casual efficiency of a predator dividing its prey. According to his calculations, the current value of the ranch exceeded $20 million, making his 50% stake worth at least $10 million, money Jake simply didn't have. But Thornfield had come prepared with an alternative proposition that made Jake's stomach turn. Instead of demanding immediate payment, Thornfield offered to buy out Jake his remaining share for what he called a generous settlement of $5 million. Jake would be free to walk away from the debt and start fresh somewhere else, while Thornfield would transform the Broken Arrow into a luxury housing development called Heritage Oaks. The name itself felt like a mockery of everything the ranch represented. As Thornfield's team began taking photographs and measurements, treating the ranch like it was already theirs, Jake felt a rage building inside him that threatened to explode. But it was what Thornfield said next that revealed the true depths of the betrayal. With a cruel smile, he mentioned that Samuel's partnership agreement had included a clause requiring absolute secrecy about their arrangement. Samuel had spent 25 years living in fear that his family would discover his moment of weakness, and that shame had eaten away at him until the day he died. The revelation that his father had carried this burden alone for decades broke something inside Jake. But as Thornfield prepared to leave, promising to return in a week for Jake's final decision, he dropped one more bombshell that would change everything. He mentioned that Jake's sister Emma had already been contacted about the situation and had expressed interest in Thornfield as development plans, seeing them as a way to finally profit from the ranch she'd never wanted to be part of. That evening, Jake confronted Emma over the phone, his voice shaking with a mixture of hurt and fury. His sister's response was everything he'd feared. She was indeed in contact with Thornfield and saw his offer as a blessing in disguise. Emma had always resented the ranch, feeling that it had consumed their father's attention and left little room for anything else in the family. To her, Thornfield's development plan represented freedom from a legacy she'd never wanted and financial security she'd never had. The conversation revealed fractures in their relationship that had been building for years. Emma accused Jake of being just like their father, so obsessed with preserving the past that he could unsee practical solutions for the future. She pointed out that Jake had no wife, no children, and no real reason to sacrifice everything for a piece of land that would ultimately bankrupt him. Her words stung because they contained a grain of truth that Jake couldn't ignore. Desperate for answers and allies, Jake reached out to Miguel Santos, the ranch's longtime foreman, who had worked alongside Samuel for over 20 years. If anyone knew about Samuel's struggles during the late 1990s, it would be Miguel. The conversation that followed painted a picture of Samuel Mitchell that Jake had never seen. A proud man, pushed to the brink of desperation, working 18-hour days and going without meals to stretch every dollar while keeping up appearances for his family and the community. Miguel revealed that there had been nights when Samuel would sit alone in the barn, staring at old family photos and crying like a broken man. The foreman had watched his boss age 10 years in the span of one, carrying a burden that no one should have to bear alone. But Miguel also shared something that gave Jake hope. Samuel had spent his final years frantically searching for a way to break free from Thornfield's grip, consulting with lawyers, exploring refinancing options, and even considering selling off portions of the ranch to raise the money needed to buy back his freedom. The most devastating revelation came when Miguel pulled out a letter that Samuel had written to Jake but never sent, found among the foreman's possessions after Samuel's death. In the letter, Samuel apologized for his deception and begged Jake's forgiveness for the impossible situation he was leaving behind. But the letter also contained a clue that would become Jake's lifeline. Samuel mentioned that he believed Thornfield had gained his partnership through fraudulent means, taking advantage of Samuel's desperation and lack of legal representation during the ranch's darkest hour. If Jake could prove fraud or coercion, he might be able to invalidate the partnership agreement entirely. Armed with new determination and his father's hidden letter, Jake embarked on a desperate investigation into the origins of the partnership agreement. He drove to Austin to visit the state archives, searching through business records and court filings from 25 years ago. What he discovered was a pattern of behavior that painted Marcus Thornfield as a predator who specialized in acquiring distressed properties through questionable means. Jake found records of at least 6 other ranchers who had entered into similar partnerships with Thornfield during the cattle crisis, and in each case, the ranchers had eventually lost their properties when they couldn't meet the impossible repayment terms. Several of the agreements contained nearly identical language and clauses, suggesting they were template contracts designed to trap desperate property owners rather than legitimate business partnerships. The breakthrough came when Jake tracked down Robert Carson, a former rancher who had lost his family spread to Thornfield 15 years earlier. Carson, now working as a mechanic in a small town outside Houston, was initially reluctant to talk about his experience. But when Jake explained his situation, Carson's anger overcame his caution. He revealed that Thornfield's standard operating procedure involved targeting ranchers during their most vulnerable moments, offering loans with terms that seemed reasonable on the surface but contained hidden clauses that made repayment nearly impossible. Carson's partnership agreement had been signed without proper legal representation, just like Samuel's, and contained a clause that allowed Thornfield to change the terms of repayment unilaterally if certain conditions weren't met. Carson had discovered too late that these conditions were designed to be impossible to fulfill, essentially guaranteeing that Thornfield would eventually own the property outright. But Carson also revealed something that gave Jake hope. Several of the ranchers who had lost their properties to Thornfield were now part of a class action lawsuit alleging fraud and predatory lending practices. The lawsuit was being handled by Sarah Martinez, a lawyer from Dallas who specialized in cases involving corporate land grabs and agricultural fraud. Carson provided Jake with Martinez's contact information and urged him to reach out immediately, warning that Thornfield's deadline was likely designed to prevent Jake from having time to mount a proper legal defense. As Jake prepared to return to the ranch, he received a call from Miguel with urgent news. Thornfield's surveying team had returned to the property without permission and were marking sections of land with stakes and flags, acting as if they already owned the place. More troubling, several of the ranch's longtime workers had been approached by Thornfield's representatives and offered jobs with a competing ranch operation, clearly an attempt to undermine the Broken Arrow's operations and force Jake into an even more desperate position. The final confrontation came sooner than expected. Jake arrived back at the ranch to find Thornfield waiting for him, this time without his usual entourage of lawyers and assistants. The businessman's demeanor had shifted from predatory confidence to barely contained irritation. Word of Jake's investigation had reached him, and he was clearly unhappy about the young rancher's refusal to accept defeat gracefully. What followed was a tense conversation that revealed the true nature of both men. Thornfield made it clear that he had faced legal challenges before and had the resources to fight them indefinitely, while Jake would quickly exhaust his limited funds trying to prove fraud in court. But Jake had learned something important from his father's hidden letter and his conversations with other victims. Sometimes the most powerful weapon against a bully was the simple refusal to be intimidated. Jake's response surprised Thornfield. Instead of negotiating or pleading, Jake calmly informed the businessman that he had contacted Sarah Martinez and would be joining the class action lawsuit. More importantly, Jake had also reached out to investigative journalists who specialized in exposing corporate fraud, and several were interested in telling the story of how Thornfield Industries preyed on vulnerable ranching families during times of crisis. The mention of media attention struck a nerve that Thornfield's legal threats had not. His business model depended on operating in the shadows, targeting isolated victims who lacked the resources or knowledge to fight back effectively. A high-profile investigation into his practices could expose decades of similar schemes and potentially trigger criminal charges as well as civil penalties. After a long silence, Thornfield made an unexpected counteroffer. He would sell his partnership stake back to Jake for the original loan amount plus reasonable interest, approximately $3 million, instead of the $10 million he had previously demanded. The offer came with conditions. Jake would have to sign a non-disclosure agreement preventing him from discussing their arrangement with journalists or joining the class action lawsuit. Jake's response came not from desperation or relief, but from a deeper understanding of his father's legacy. Samuel Mitchell hadn't just left behind a ranch. He had left behind a lesson about the cost of carrying burdens alone and the importance of fighting for what matters. Jake rejected Thornfield's offer, choosing instead to face the uncertainty of a legal battle rather than perpetuate the cycle of secrecy and shame that had tormented his father. 6 months later, the class action lawsuit resulted in a settlement that invalidated dozens of fraudulent partnership agreements, including the one that had threatened the Broken Arrow Ranch. Jake's willingness to stand up to Thornfield had not only saved his family's legacy, but had helped other families reclaim theirs as well. As he stood on the same porch where his journey had begun, watching the sunrise over land that was truly his once again, Jake understood that sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't property or money. It is the courage to do what's right, even when the cost seems unbearable.